Hi, welcome to our 12th course, Apologetics Courses for Beginners, and I'm here today with Dr. Liz Jackson, and we're talking about Pascal's wager. And you might be wondering why we're even talking about Pascal's wager in an apologetics course. Well, you're about to find out. Pascal's wager has been around for a long time, but it's also just, I think, super important to incorporate this type of reasoning, especially like there's a reason why we did this as the last course, as course number 12, because we've already talked about a whole lot of evidence for Christianity in particular that's going to play a significant role in what you're about to hear from Dr. Jackson. So, but I think that it's important that this is a very common thing that you hear. Most people actually who are not into apologetics have at least probably heard of something like Pascal's wager. And a lot of atheists that I see online will say things like, Pascal's wager, this idea that, or whatever Pascal's wager is about, they'll say that this is a bad argument. And they'll, so Pascal's wager is actually really, I think, is sort of embedded in pop culture and just culture more generally. So I think it's good that we talk about it, but also talk about some of the work that's been done in very recent years by Liz herself. So let's go ahead and introduce you, Dr. Liz Jackson. The first time you were on Capturing Christianity, you were just Liz Jackson, but now you are official Dr. Liz Jackson. Give me and the audience an update on where you're at and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited for what we're going to talk about today. So I just finished my postdoc at Australian National University, which was kind of a weird postdoc because I actually ended up not being in Australia for a lot of it because of like the fires and coronavirus. So it was an interesting year. It was still a good postdoc. And I just started a job at Ryerson University, which is a school in Toronto, as an assistant professor of philosophy. So I'm actually starting remotely, and my husband and I will be in the US actually potentially until sometime in 2021, sort of depending on when classes end up going in person or when they need me to come in person. So we're sort of playing it by ear. It's been a little bit of a weird year. I'm probably not the only one who's in that boat. But yeah, so I did my PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame, and my main, I guess, philosophical interest is in philosophy of religion and epistemology. And Pascal's wager is sort of one of the primary things in philosophy of religion that I'm interested in and that I'm doing research on.
Yeah, why Pascal's wager for you? What was it about that sort of grabbed your interest?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we sort of at the end talk a little bit about the role that Pascal's wager, I think, has to play in like an overall case for either theism or Christianity. But I guess I got interested in it, I think potentially because I think it's a little bit underrated. So I think a lot of people, like you said, hear it and kind of dismiss it quickly or say, oh, like the many gods objection, it must be a terrible argument or something, And so I think it actually, there's a lot more power behind it than people acknowledge. And so part of what I hope to do is at least help people see this argument is interesting. It's at least worth entertaining. I'm not necessarily saying everyone's going to be completely convinced or it's going to make everyone a Christian, but I think it's a pretty interesting argument. So I got into it kind of in undergrad, and then since then I've been, interested in some decision theory stuff, but also some ways that Pascal's wager interacts with like questions in contemporary epistemology, which we're going to talk about today too. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah. Well, I'm excited. Let's go ahead and start the presentation. I'll pull it up on my screen. So it's up now, and then you feel free to take the floor. And if I have a question about something, I may interrupt, but the goal is for me to just sit quiet the whole time. So take it away.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I've tried to make this as accessible as possible, just like it says, Pascal's wager introduction. So an introductory course, but if there's something I forget to define or explain or you need an example, please feel free to interrupt me. All right, so let's start with this first slide. So right now, especially if you've listened to these in order, you've heard a lot of theistic arguments, like the fine-tuning argument and the cosmological argument. And most of these arguments are for the conclusion that God exists. So that's their final conclusion. And Pascal's wager, which I would argue is still a theistic argument, has a slightly different conclusion. And that's the conclusion that you should believe in God. So the first question you might ask, well, you should believe in God. Well, what kind of should? Like what should does that even mean? And the first, I guess, thing to note about the should is it's the should of means ends rationality. So what that means is that it's in your best interest to believe in God. So this is kind of similar to cases like when your mom says you should brush your teeth, or your financial advisor says you should save for retirement. They're not necessarily saying that it's a moral requirement, but it's something that's good for you to do so. And I also want to note here, you could have a version of Pascal's wager that makes it in terms of a moral requirement, but right now I'm just going to kind of start off with the classic version, which is this kind of should of means end rationality. Okay, so we have this conclusion that you should believe in God for like a means end rationality kind of should. Well, where do we start? And I think what we should start with is our best theory of means end rationality, and that's decision theory. So we're going to start there, and basically what I'm going to do is give a very basic introduction to decision theory and then kind of show how that applies to Pascal's wager. And before we jump into that, I wanted to note that there's sort of two ways you can approach Pascal's wager. The first is a historical way. And so if you were approaching Pascal's wager this way, you would kind of look at Pascal's historical context, you would read the text, the Pensée, very closely, you would read, other related works that Pascal wrote, and sort of try to make a case for what was Pascal saying, what was kind of his argument. It would be a lot of interpretation. You could, also evaluate the argument at the same time, but it's a lot of sort of historical stuff. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do, but that's not really what I'm going to be focusing on today. Today, what I'm going to talk about is going to be much more ideas focused. So basically, I'm going to kind of present an argument that I think is inspired by the argument that Pascal gave. And then I want to just think about its philosophical merits and objections, and then think about whether we can give plausible replies to those objections or not. So we're going to have kind of an ideas focused approach to the wager. Okay. So here's an overview of what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk about the basics of decision theory, and I'm just going to go through a really basic example that sort of illustrates how decision theory works. And then we're going to take that and we're going to apply it to the very basic version of Pascal's wager. And then what we're going to do is we're going to cover 4 objections to Pascal's wager and replies to those objections. So that's the many gods objection, the impossibility objection, the irrationality objection, and Pascal's mugging. And then I'm going to have a slide that's some additional objections we don't have space to cover today, but I'll point you guys to some places where you can kind of learn more about those objections. And actually, I forgot to put this in there. And then I want to talk about the role that Pascal's wager plays in sort of this larger apologetics framework, or in this larger case for theism or Christianity. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some further resources that, if you're interested in Pascal's wager or going deeper, you should check out. Okay. All right, so let's start with decision theory. So what is decision theory? And specifically, we're going to talk about decision theory, how to make a decision when you're uncertain about something that's really important or relevant for that decision. And I want to note, and I've said this before on Cam's channel, that you can use decision theory to make almost any decision. So like whether you should eat like oatmeal or eggs for breakfast, whether you should buy car insurance, whether you should go on a trip, maybe when there's like a pandemic, that could be an interesting decision to make during using decision theory. But the idea is that decision theory, it can apply to almost anything. And what I'm going to do today is give just a really basic decision and show how you would make that with decision theory. And then hopefully you can kind of use that framework to see how it could apply more broadly. Okay, so here's the decision. Let's say I give you an opportunity to play a game with me. And in this game, I'm going to flip a coin. If the coin lands heads, I will give you $10. If the coin lands tails, you have to give me $1. And you can choose to play this game or not play this game. It's totally up to you, but I'm just giving you this opportunity. So this first matrix at the top of the slide basically represents this game. So there's heads and tails. Both of those have probability 0.5. And then there's play and don't play. And I'll just give you some of the basic terminology that people in decision theory use, because I'll probably use it a little bit throughout. So it's just good to be clear about the terms. They're not crazy big words. There's acts, which is things you can do. So that would be play or not play. And then there's states, or states of the world. And these are just ways the world could be. So the relevant ways the world could be for this game would be the coin lands heads and the coin lands tails. And note that both of those have a probability associated with them. And that's going to be an important part of all the decision theory that we're doing today. And then you have what's called outcomes. And outcomes are the situation when you take a certain action given a certain state of the world, right? So I said, if you play and it lands heads, you get $10. That would be an outcome. If you play and it lands tails, you lose $1. And if you don't play, then no matter what happens, you don't gain or lose money. So there's acts, there's states, and there's outcomes. Okay, so we're going to do like one more decision theory word, and then that's it. The last decision theory word is expected value. And some people call this expected utility. You can just think about utility as basically the same thing as value, and I'll use those interchangeably, but just try to focus on value. Okay, so what expected value is, it's basically how to figure out the value of taking a certain action, given that you're uncertain about some of the relevant facts. So let's think about the car insurance example. You're not certain whether you're going to get in a wreck or not. And so one way you can sort of figure out whether you should get car insurance or not is by calculating the expected value of getting car insurance and then the expected value of not getting car insurance. And the reason that it's expected value and not actual value is because of the uncertainty. So if you knew you were going to get in a wreck, or you knew you weren't going to get in a wreck, then you could just either buy insurance or not, and you wouldn't have to rely on the expected value. You could just rely on the actual value because you know the relevant facts. But expected value helps us figure out what to do when we're sort of not certain about what's going to happen. So when we have to make a decision, but we have a limited viewpoint. Okay, so basically what you can do is you can put the acts and put the states into a table like this one, and then use that to calculate the expected value. And the basic rule is multiply down and then add across. So we have these states, which is heads and tails, and both of those have a 0.5 probability. We're assuming it's a fair coin. And what you do is you take that 0.5 and you multiply it down the column. And then same again with tails, you take that 0.5 and you multiply it down the column. And then you add, after you multiply, you add across to figure out the expected value of each action. So you take 0.5, you multiply that by 10, you multiply that by 0. You take 0.5, you multiply that by -1, you multiply that by 0, and then you add across. So 0.5 times 10 is 5, 0.5 times -1 is -0.5. So the expected value of that is 4.5. And then in the other case, 0.5 times 0 is 0, 0.5 times 0 is 0, so the expected value is 0. So I know there's like some formulas and some math on this slide, but it really is just basic multiplication and addition. So I hope that makes sense in terms of the basic rule. And then what you want to pick is you want to pick the act that has the highest expected value. And some you might hear, if you look into some more decision theory stuff, they'll call this maximizing expected value. And so what that means is it's not guaranteed that if you just play one time, you're going to get money, right? Because it could land tails and then you lose $1. But what it means is over time, if you play this game again and again and again and again, you're going to average out getting $4.50 each time. So again, we're in a situation of uncertainty. It's not guaranteed that this is going to give us money, but given that we don't know whether it lands heads or tails, this is kind of our best bet, which is we should play the game because 4.5 is bigger than 0. Okay, so that's decision theory. What we're going to do now is we're going to apply this to Pascal's wager. And so I picked this example because the structure of the decision table is actually very similar to the basic version of Pascal's wager. Okay, so again, we have two acts. So we're thinking about, should I believe in God or not? Well, what could I do? I can believe in God or I could not believe in God. And then there's sort of two relevant ways the world could be. God exists or God doesn't exist. And let's say we're uncertain about whether does God exist or not, I don't know. And then you can actually just use decision theory to figure out whether it's rational to believe in God or not. And we're going to do the same thing again. Remember, it's multiply down and add across. Okay, so what I've put in, I don't want to presuppose anything about the probability of God existing or the probability of God not existing. So I just put in for the probability that God exists, and then 1 minus n for the probability God doesn't exist. And all that means is that those two states need to add up to 1. And so in decision theory, probabilities are represented from 0 to 1. And maybe I should have said this earlier, so you might have noticed the coin flip, it was 0.5, 0.5. That represents 50% probability. But the thought is, since God exists or God doesn't exist, those are exhaustive and exclusive. The probability of those two needs to add to 1. And that's all I'm assuming. I'm not assuming anything about what those probabilities are. Okay, so here's how the wager goes. Well, if you believe in God and God exists, you go to heaven. There's an infinite gain, so that's infinitely good. If you don't believe in God and God exists, let's say you go to hell, infinite loss, so that's negative infinity. And if God doesn't exist, then what you gain or lose either way is finite. So then we multiply down. So we do the probability that God exists times infinity plus 1 minus n times finite. That just drops out because that's a finite value. And so as long as the probability that God exists isn't 0, so as long as there's some chance, even if it's really, really small, that God exists, the expected value of believing in God is infinite. And then the same reasoning applies to not believing in God. N times negative infinity, as long as n isn't 0, negative infinity, and then 1 minus n times finite is finite, so negative infinity. So believing in God is infinitely better than not believing in God. So by the same reasoning, remember we're maximizing expected value. According to decision theory, you should believe in God. Okay, so that's basically the very basic version of Pascal's wager and how we use decision theory to get to that wager. And I do want to note that I'll talk about this in a second. I think that the ultimately successful version of Pascal's wager can't be this simple, but I think it's really good to have this on the table and also have the decision theory background so people can sort of understand the reasoning. Okay. Things to note about this wager. I've already said this, that the probability that God exists must be greater than 0. So if you just assign probability 0 to God existing, then that's one way to get out of this argument. It's worth noting that most people who work on probability theory think this is irrational because 0 isn't a contradiction or an impossibility. God existing isn't a contradiction or an impossibility, but that is one way you can kind of get out of this argument from the get-go. The second thing to note is that it basically relies on this simple trumping principle, which is that infinities trump finites. So because infinities have this trumping power, the probability that God exists doesn't matter as long as it's greater than 0. So that's important because we're going to talk about that more later, and all infinite versions of Pascal's wager rely on something like this, but we're going to have to weaken it because of an objection we're about to talk about. So the probability God exists has to be bigger than 0, and we have this principle that infinities trump finites. Okay, so now we're going to talk about 4 objections to Pascal's wager. And the first is one that I think after you hear Pascal's wager, a lot of people bring this up, even just like in a freshman philosophy class. This is something they're all really worried about, and I think some people on this basis just completely reject Pascal's wager. They just say there's many gods and, so it's all over. And I think that's totally wrong, but I wanted to address this objection first because it's so common. So here's the thought. Well, you've set up the wager in terms of there being 2 actions, believe in God and not believe in God. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that because it's not just that you believe in God or you don't believe in God, but there's actually multiple religions. And even more, just because you believe in or practice one religion won't give you the rewards or won't guarantee that you go to heaven if another religion is true. So I've set up a slightly more complicated decision table, but this decision table just involves 2 religions, so Christianity and Islam. And notice that, if you believe in the Christian God and God exists, infinity, infinity, you can go to heaven. But if you believe in the Christian God and the Muslim God exists, on most versions of Islam, you'll go to hell. So then, even though this finite column will drop out because we have this idea that infinities trump finites, we still have this weird expected value where you have infinity plus negative infinity. And this is starting to get into the realm of things that are just not even mathematically well defined. And note too that the Muslim God has the same expected value. Believing in the Muslim God, it doesn't really give you a reason to prefer being a Christian to being a Muslim. You might think, okay, don't believe in God. Well, that seems really bad because it's negative infinity minus negative infinity. We're going to talk about that in a second. So this is the basic structure of the many gods objection, and obviously you can add a lot more religions here as well. But the thought is that Pascal's wager doesn't really give us a reason to practice one religion over another, especially if they both have heaven and hell as part of the theology of the religions.
So one quick thing to note, you on the previous slide, you said negative infinity minus negative infinity, but it's negative infinity plus negative infinity.
Oh, yeah, sure. Right. Thank you. Sorry. Which is weird because then it is kind of still minus, but anyway, again, this is just getting into mathematical weirdness that we don't really want to, but yes, you're right. It should be plus. So thank you for that. Cool. Thanks, Cam. All right, cool. So two things to note about the many gods objection again. So A, B, and C is what I put for the probabilities of each religion. And obviously, again, if you assign one religion probability 0, then that religion will drop out. It won't matter. But as long as you think, maybe I'm a Christian, but there's some chance that Islam is true, even if it's a pretty low probability, then it doesn't seem like you would have a reason to be a Christian over being a Muslim, at least according to Pascal's wager. But here's what gets really weird about the many gods objection. So let's think about this possibility, which I think a lot of people will think is counterintuitive, but it's at least worth thinking about. And this is the possibility that all atheists go to heaven and all theists go to hell. You might think that seems really unlikely or that seems crazy. But again, according to probability theory, what we were talking about earlier, because it's not a contradiction, it's not an impossibility, at least arguably, then we shouldn't assign it probability 0. So we should give it a non-zero probability that theists go to hell and atheists go to heaven. But if there's some chance that theists go to hell and atheists go to heaven, then the atheist can actually kind of make the same argument that the Muslim is making and say, look, guys, let's say that this weird worldview is true. I think we call it atheism plus. Atheisms get this big reward and theists go to hell. Then it doesn't seem like there's actually any reason to practice a religion at all, because there's still a chance that by practicing a religion, you actually go to hell, and the atheists are the ones who go to heaven. So when you actually break it down, the many gods objection not only says we can't really decide between religions, but it actually says we don't actually even have a reason to be a theist over being an atheist. Okay, so things are looking pretty bad for Pascal's wager. Nonetheless, I think the many gods objection is in some sense a problem for Pascal's wager, but it's just a problem for kind of a naive version of Pascal's wager. So one way that I put it is that it's a structural problem for sort of setting up the decision table in a certain way, but it's not a substantive problem. So I'm going to explain why I think that. And I guess, too, what I wanted to do in this presentation is not just represent my own view, but sort of represent the different views that philosophers have defended on how to respond to this objection. And so basically, I put them in two categories. Okay, so the first way you can kind of get around this many gods objection is you can just remove infinities from Pascal's wager completely. So a lot of the problems that we noted by having negative infinity plus infinity or whatever, those problems are created because we're using infinities in Pascal's wager. But if you only have finite values, then those problems kind of go away. But you have to have a view on which a religion has to be probable, at least to a certain degree, before you should wager for it. So Mike Rhoda, for example, and I'm going to talk more about his view later too, he has a view where he removes infinities and then says you should wager for a religion or wager for Christianity if the probability of it is above 0.5. So depending on what you replace the infinities with, you could get that threshold to be lower, but the idea is you still have to have this threshold. So the pro of this view is that you get rid of these complications that are caused by infinities, but the con of this view is you actually do lose some of the original power of the wager because you have to have this probability threshold. So that is one view that I think is a live possibility and on the table, and I like that view. It's not the view I personally defend, but I think it's worth noting you can kind of have this finite version of Pascal's wager. And actually this version will get around a couple other problems I'm going to talk about later. Okay, so that's Mike's view. The second view, which is the view that I like, is what you need to do is you need to adjust Pascal's wager to capture the idea that all infinities are not created equal. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give an intuitive example of this and then point you to some of my papers if you like some of the more technical ways you might solve this problem. But here's the intuitive example that I often give. So if you're choosing between two infinite goods, there's two things that are both infinitely good, and in one case you have a 0.9 chance at getting this infinite good. In another case, you only have a 0.1 chance at getting this infinite good. Clearly, you should take the 0.9 chance over the 0.1 chance. You want a higher probability of getting an infinite good rather than a lower probability of getting an infinite good. But if you just basically do this thing where you just say anything times infinity is infinity, so they're both infinite, so I should just flip a coin, that's going to say, yeah, you should be indifferent between these two infinite goods. But clearly, that's not the right result. So what we need is we need a way to kind of compare different infinities in decision theory to show that a higher chance at getting some infinite good is better than a lower chance. So if you think Christianity is much more probable than Islam, even though they both have heaven and hell, you should wager for Christianity over Islam because you want to go for that higher chance at getting the infinite good rather than the lower chance. So the pro of this is I think you can get something stronger than what Mike Rhoda says, for example. And you can get that you should wager for the religion that you take to be most probable. There's some hedges there that's not 100% correct, but that's basically correct. That what you should end up doing is wager for the religion you take to be most probable. And this also means that atheism and agnosticism aren't going to be rational. Unless you think this idea that atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell is more probable than all religions. But most people probably aren't going to think that, so most people should practice a religion. So that's the pro, is that you get a stronger version of the wager. Almost everyone should practice a religion. It's irrational to be an atheist or an agnostic. But the con of this is things do get more technical and complex because you have to deal with infinities in kind of a complicated way. So because this is introductory, I'm not going to go into those different ways you might deal with infinities, but in our paper we suggest a method that uses limits and ratios. Other people have suggested using surreal numbers, so I will be happy to, I'm going to talk about some further resources at the end, and if you're really interested in this issue, I can give you even more. So those are sort of the two main responses to the many gods objection. Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about our second objection, which is what I call the impossibility objection. So you might say, okay, Liz, I'm on board with everything you've said so far. In response to the many gods objection, yeah, I should wager for the religion I take to be most likely, but I just can't control what I believe. And I can't make myself believe that religion because I just can't control. I can't control my beliefs. And there's a fancy philosophy word for the view that we can't control our beliefs, and that's doxastic involuntarism. So doxastic just means having to do with belief or a belief-like state. And involuntarism is like involuntary, basically. So that's the view we can't control our beliefs. And more specifically, we can't control any of our beliefs. So here's how this argument might go. Premise one, I can't believe in God because doxastic involuntarism is true. Then premise two says, if I can't believe in God, then I shouldn't believe in God. And this is motivated with principles. There's a family of principles that philosophers often call ought implies can. And basically what these principles say is if you should do something, then it has to be possible for you to do it. So if Cam was like, Liz, you're morally obligated to go save all of the orphans in the world. I mean, that would be a great thing, but that's just too difficult for one person to do, right? So a lot of people say our moral obligations, or actually in this case, we're talking about means ends obligations, but those two different kinds of obligations we have are constrained by what we can do. So that's why, there's these amazing tasks that would be wonderful for someone to do, but we don't have an obligation to do it because it would just be too difficult. So the thought is then, because of ought implies can principles, if I can't believe in God, I shouldn't believe in God. And then the conclusion is I shouldn't believe in God. In other words, I shouldn't take Pascal's wager. Okay, so how would we respond to this kind of objection? I think there are at least 3 ways we can respond. So the first response denies premise 1. Premise 1 says I can't believe in God because of doxastic involuntarism. So this premise says actually you can control your belief in God, or you could at least control it a lot more than you thought. And I think the first thing to note here is that this doesn't mean that you have control over all of your beliefs. And a lot of people that like doxastic involuntarism will say things like, well, look, if I gave you $100 to believe 1 + 1 = 3, you can't believe it, so you can't control any of your beliefs. But that's a really big generalization from only a specific case. And so in my view, there's certain beliefs that are either just obviously true or obviously false. And those we don't really have control over, at least not any kind of direct control. But when it comes to beliefs that we're more torn about, like maybe you're really torn about whether the government should require people to wear masks, and you can kind of see the arguments on both sides. Like maybe you think it would be safer, but you worry that that's in government overreach, and you're really you're really torn. It's a lot less clear that you can't kind of just make a decision to believe, you know what, like we should wear masks, that's safer, it should be government mandated, or the opposite. So when we think about propositions that are just a lot less obvious, whether they're true or false, I think it's plausible we have a lot more control over them. Okay, so I think one way you can go is just deny premise 1 and say we can control our beliefs, especially certain beliefs, like whether we believe in God or whether we believe in a certain religion. So response 2 involves denying this idea that if you ought to believe in God, then you can believe in God, or at least show why that claim is actually pretty limited. So you might say, I can't, like, Cam, if you're like, I'll give you $10 to snap your fingers. Okay, I can just snap my fingers, right? I don't even have to really think about it. But sometimes it seems like we can't control our beliefs at least that quickly. But just because we can't directly control something doesn't mean we can't control it over the long run. It doesn't mean we can't try to control it, And I like to give, one example I like to give is actually like making dinner. So I can't just snap my fingers and there be dinner on the table, but over sort of a process of maybe an hour, I can like cut up vegetables and heat the stove and put oil in the pan and all that stuff. And then dinner is made eventually. An even longer term example would be like losing weight. You can control your weight even if it's over the long term and not immediately. And so the thought is a similar thing might apply to belief in God. So even if the premise says if I can't believe in God, then I shouldn't believe in God. Well, that might apply to direct control. I can't believe in God directly, so I shouldn't believe in God directly. But that doesn't mean, I shouldn't try to believe in God, or I shouldn't try to have like a long-term project to commit to trying to believe in God or something like that. So I think we can kind of expose the limitations of premise 2. Even if I can't directly believe in God, that doesn't mean, I can't try. Okay, and then final response is that we can actually sort of set belief to the side and not even think about what we should or shouldn't believe, but just think about action or commitment. So what should I commit my life to, or what action should I take? This doesn't mean I need to change my beliefs, but it means I genuinely commit to, for example, seeking a relationship with God, or having faith in God, or going to church, or joining a Bible study, or praying, or something like that. And so we can actually get a version of the wager that doesn't even say anything about belief at all, but just tells us how we ought to act or what we should commit to. Okay, so that's the response to the impossibility objection. And then our third objection is the irrationality objection. Okay, so the impossibility objection, that's just about what we can and cannot control. So it's just about, philosophers might call it descriptive questions. Questions about the way the world is, the way our psychology is. The irrationality objection isn't about these descriptive questions, but it's about normative questions. So what we should do. So someone might say, well, sure, you can believe in God on the basis of Pascal's wager. You can control your belief in God to an extent, but that doesn't mean you should. And if you believe on the basis of Pascal's wager, that's actually irrational. Okay, so why would that be irrational? Well, one reason you might think is because of this view that's called evidentialism. And I will note here, actually, a lot of people throw around the word evidentialism, but it actually takes a lot of different forms. So one thing just in general we should do is when we throw around words like this is be careful about what we mean, because I think there's at least like 10 different versions of evidentialism, and they all have different implications. But here's a really basic version of this thing that's called evidentialism. It says we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, right? So if you have a ton of evidence for something, but you don't believe it, that's irrational. If you have like no evidence for something, but you just believe it anyway because you want it to be true, that's irrational. Okay. So here's a way we can use evidentialism to make this irrationality objection to Pascal's wager. Premise 1 says I should proportion my beliefs to the evidence. This is on the basis of evidentialism. Premise 2 says if I should take Pascal's wager, then I should not proportion my beliefs to the evidence. So premise 3, I shouldn't take Pascal's wager. And that's because so if you watch Tim's thing on argument forums, in the conditional claim, the consequent is false, which is the part that comes after the then, so then the part that's after the if is false. Okay, so that's the irrationality objection. Again, we can sort of give 3 replies to this irrationality objection. Okay, response 1. So response 1 is evidentialism, which says, premise 1 is evidentialism, which says I should proportion my beliefs to the evidence. And one thing you can say in response to this is, well, this premise is actually ambiguous. And it's ambiguous between 2 kinds of shoulds. So remember when we first started talking about Pascal's wager, and I think like the second slide, we said Pascal's wager is about means and shoulds. But actually, evidentialism normally is not about means and shoulds, but it's about what's called an epistemic should. And an epistemic should is a should that has to do with knowledge. So what's our best way at getting knowledge, of knowing things? That's what an epistemic should is about. A means and should is broader, because we have goals other than just knowing things. We want to be happy, we want to live a fulfilling life, we want to flourish. Not all of that is just about knowledge. So we have goals that go beyond just knowing things. So Pascal's wager isn't about just our goals about knowledge, it's about general sort of life plans that can go beyond knowledge. So I said it's a means and should. It's also, you could think of it as like a practical should. So the thought is maybe evidentialism is true with respect to certain goals we have to know things, but those aren't our only goals. And Pascal's wager sort of comes in with respect to these other goals, these goals of meeting our goals. So the thought is evidentialism is true in one sense, but Pascal's wager is talking about a different kind of should. So that's kind of one response you can give, is deny premise 1 because it's kind of equivocating. It's using this word in 2 different ways, the word should. Evidentialism applies to the epistemic should, but Pascal's wager is about the means and should. Okay, a second response is to deny premise 2. Premise 2 said, if I should take Pascal's wager, then this means I shouldn't proportion my beliefs to the evidence. And I think that plausibly you could take Pascal's wager while proportioning your beliefs to the evidence, especially in cases where you don't think that either theism or Christianity is super, super, super unlikely. So if you think you just have no evidence for Christianity or no evidence for theism, then maybe, yeah, Pascal's wager would require you don't proportion your beliefs to the evidence. But if your evidence for theism is what I call underdetermined. So it sort of leaves open more than one rational response. It means that, maybe you've looked hard at the evidence and you're like, man, the problem of evil is hard, problem of divine hiddenness, that's tough. But like, there's also these really interesting arguments for theism, the argument for the resurrection, cosmological, ontological fine-tuning. There's all these different arguments. And you're like, I can kind of see the world like as a standalone thing, but I can also kind of see it as being created by someone, So if you're kind of in this place where you're like, these options are both live for you, then either attitude fits your evidence. That's what it means for this rational underdetermination. That's what that means. It means that you could be an atheist or an agnostic or a theist and be rational because you have evidence for all of those positions in a way. So if you're in this kind of situation, you can totally take Pascal's wager and still respect evidentialism. So there's actually no conflict at all, epistemic or means and should conflicts. Okay, so those are two responses. And then the third response is actually the exact same as from the first objection, which is that you can actually, again, set belief completely aside, just frame the wager in terms of commitment, and then you won't have any issues with evidentialism because the wager is just about how you should act, not what you should believe. Okay. So this is the final objection, and I think this one's kind of fun, so I put it at the end. And this is called Pascal's mugging, and it's from a paper by Nick Bostrom. I forgot what year, but it's in the journal called Analysis. Okay, so here's Pascal's mugging. So a mugger comes up to Pascal in a dark alleyway, but Pascal notices that this mugger doesn't have any kind of weapon at all. And Pascal's like, what are you doing? Like, how do you expect to get any money off of me? And the mugger gets this genius idea, and he's like, hey, Pascal, if you give me your wallet right now, I'm going to deposit $1 million in your bank account tomorrow. I promise. Really, I will. And so the thought is, like, look, this is actually sort of similar to Pascal's wager, especially if you think Christianity or theism is pretty unlikely. Like, Pascal's like, look, it's probably true that this guy is lying to me, but there's some chance he's like a secret millionaire and he will give me this money. So, look, I'll give him my wallet now. It's sort of a small cost compared to $1 million. And even though it's a really low probability, it's sort of worth the risk to get all this money. And so then the idea is like, well, that's similar to someone taking Pascal's wager. You're going to devote your whole life to God. I mean, that's like a pretty big cost. That's kind of similar to like giving someone your wallet. I mean, maybe it's a small cost relative to going to heaven, but it's still a cost. So even if it's really unlikely that you'll go to heaven, the thought is like, if you think that's a good argument, it's really unlikely that I go to heaven, but because I have so much to gain, I should go ahead and do it. Then the thought is like, Pascal should also give this mugger his wallet. So here's a way to formalize the argument. Pascal should not give the mugger his wallet. I feel like most people think that's irrational. Even if there's some chance the mugger's telling the truth, he's almost definitely lying, and it's not worth giving up the wallet. So that's the first premise. Second premise says the mugging and the wager are similar. In other words, if Pascal shouldn't give the mugger his wallet, then I shouldn't take Pascal's wager. So therefore, I shouldn't take Pascal's wager. Okay, so that's Pascal's mugging. And here's how I like to respond to Pascal's mugging, and that's by denying premise 2. Premise 2 was the one that basically said the wager and the mugging are similar. And what I want to point out is I think there's some key differences between the wager and the mugging. Okay, so one thing that I think is true about the mugging is that as the mugger, as his claims get more and more extreme, Pascal should think that the probability that he's lying is higher and higher. So if the mugger was like, hey, if you give me your wallet now, I'll give you $10 tomorrow, that might, I mean, it's still probably unlikely, but that's decent. There's a higher chance of that. But then if it's $1 million, that's really unlikely. And then if it's a $1 trillion, that's even more unlikely. There's like very few people that actually have that much money in the world. But the thought is, if as the claims he's making about how much money Pascal's going to get bigger and bigger, if the probability that he's lying gets higher and higher, so Pascal trusts him less and less, You can actually work out the math so that Pascal should never give the mugger his wallet. But when it comes to Pascal's wager, it's not really going to work that way because the probability of these religions doesn't really depend on, I mean, it might to an extent depend on the exact claims they make, but it's not going to have this exact inverse relationship that the mugger will. So the math isn't going to work out in the wager in the same way that it's going to work out in the mugging. So that's one potential difference. I mean, another thing to note is with the wager, you can also give arguments for a certain religion that make it a lot higher. And, if the mugger is like, hey, let me show you my bank account, I really have $1 million, and he starts giving you all this evidence that he really will give you the money, then maybe at a certain point you should take the mugging, So I think you should give him the wallet. So I think that actually might be similar with both the mugging and the wager. But yeah, I think that's a really important difference. So that's way one. Okay, then way two basically says, look, sometimes it's rational to take a chance on a low probability but really good outcome, even if that comes with a cost. So here's some examples of that. Let's say you've been really sick with this disease that doctors, they just can't figure out what's wrong with you, and it's just caused a lot of issues and trauma and pain in your life. And the doctors say, hey, we might have found a potential cure. It's still a pretty low probability, but there's a chance it'll cure you, but it's kind of expensive. It even costs maybe a couple $1,000s or something. It's not at all obvious to me that you shouldn't pay that money to get a potential cure, even if the probability is low, because it could relieve you from all this suffering that you've been going through. You might also think sometimes it's rational to donate money to fight a low probability catastrophe, so like a worldwide nuclear war. So you might think it could be rational to donate money to like a charity whose job is to kind of fight worldwide nuclear war, even if that's a really improbable thing, because it would be so bad if that happened. It's worth giving a little money for that. And it's actually funny, I know we're going to get to this later, but there's actually sort of a similar argument that you should wear masks as well. So wearing a mask does come with some cost. It's uncomfortable, maybe it's hard to breathe, it's really hot, especially in the summer, right? But even if you think there's a low probability that the mask actually does anything, as long as there's some probability that it's like literally saving people's lives, you could actually argue wearing a mask might be rational for similar reasons. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, but that's kind of a very real life example of this. But here's the point. There's a lot of these cases where there's a low probability but really good outcome that you have to pay some cost to get. And it's not at all obvious that all of these are irrational. Some of them, like Pascal's mugging, might be clearly irrational, but some of them, like the medicine case or the nuclear war case, seem rational. And we need to kind of draw a line between the rational and irrational cases of this, but as long as some of them are rational, it's not at all obvious that Pascal's wager is going to fall sort of on the irrational side of the line rather than on the rational side of the line. So that's sort of the second way out of Pascal's mugging. Okay, what we haven't had space to cover today. And this is actually not an exhaustive list either, but here's some additional objections that I think are interesting and worth thinking about. The first is what's called the mixed strategies objection. And basically what this objection tries to show is that the wager shows that even mundane decisions might have an infinite expected value, or weird decisions like flipping a coin and only believing in God if it lands heads. So I actually think for this objection, whatever you say about the many gods objection should probably apply here as well. So those two objections are actually going to sort of stand or fall together. And the paper that I put at the end of the slide, we talk about that extensively. So you should feel free to look there if you're interested. Another objection, trumping and infinities. So do infinite values always trump finite values? Should we always go for the infinite over the finite? And we don't have space to cover it, but I think there's some interesting arguments that maybe we shouldn't. And if you like an infinite version of Pascal's wager like I do, that could be a problem. Third objection, super religion objection. So let's say I make up a religion with like a really, really, really good heaven or a really, really, really bad hell. Does that mean everyone should start practicing it? Because even though probability matters, like we said, if you have a really good heaven or a really bad hell, that could kind of make up for the probability if it's good or bad enough. So that might be a potential problem. Okay, fourth objection, Homer Simpson objection. would God be more angry or maybe jealous if I practiced the wrong religion than if I simply lived as an atheist? So the argument would be that atheism is like neutral in a way, so it's sort of safer or less risky to live as an atheist than sort of pick a religion and practice it. And then finally, the temporal discounting objection. So temporal discounting is a big word, and that basically means you care more about the immediate future than the long-term future. And this is why some people are bad at saving for retirement. They actually did this test with kids where they said you can have 1 marshmallow right now or 2 marshmallows if you wait 15 minutes. And then it was really interesting to see which kids just took the marshmallow immediately and then which kids waited for the bigger reward. But there is interesting evidence that at least in terms of what we actually prefer, a lot of us care more about what's about to happen to us immediately than long-term stuff. So if you said, I don't really care about what happens to me in 10,000 years or 100,000 years, then that's actually a way to sort of resist Pascal's wager, because you're kind of saying, I care a lot more about this life because it's much sooner than I care about the afterlife. So I think we respond to almost all of these, maybe except for 1 or 2 in that paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager. So you should look there if you want to kind of look more at these objections. But the point is that there is a lot of interesting stuff about the wager that we haven't had space to cover here. Okay. The final thing that I wanted to talk about, which is what Cam mentioned at the beginning, is sort of the role that the wager has to play in kind of making an overall case for theism or for Christianity in particular. So if you've watched this series, this is, like I mentioned, the last video in the series, so if you've kind of watched it in order, but even if you haven't, even if you've just watched some of the videos, I think what you've seen is you've seen a case, a probably pretty extensive case, that theism is true and specifically that Christianity is true. And I think this gives us the tools to make the following argument, which I think is really interesting. And what it does is it combines those epistemic considerations that give us evidence for Christianity or help us know that Christianity is true, with these pragmatic or means-ends considerations given by Pascal's wager. And here's how the argument goes. Premise 1 says you should wager on the religion that's most likely to be true. And then premise 2 says that Christianity is the religion that's most likely to be true. So premise 3 says you should wager on Christianity. So premise 1 would be everything we've just talked about today, and how my version of the wager basically says, look, because of what's at stake, you should bet your life on a religion and the religion that you take to be most likely to be true, and it's not rational to be an atheist or an agnostic. So premise 2 is going to be supported by all the videos that you just saw, giving, the cosmological argument and the argument for the resurrection, giving all these considerations that support Christianity. And combining these, you get this really interesting conclusion that you should wager for Christianity. And I want to say 2 things about that conclusion. So the first is, what's interesting about this is it's not just the conclusion that Christianity is true, which I think would still be interesting and significant, but it actually has implications for how you should live, which is that you should commit to Christianity. You should bet your life on the truth of Christianity. And I think this is actually one reason that I think some people on the internet really don't like Pascal's wager, maybe more than some other arguments for theism. I mean, I don't have full evidence for this, but I do have some anecdotal evidence that Pascal's wager really makes people angry. But I think part of that is because it doesn't just say this thing is true, but it has implications for how you should live and what you should bet your life on. And those are that's getting personal. That's real life stuff. So in some ways, it's an even stronger conclusion, in some ways, than just the conclusion that Christianity is true. So that's the first thing I wanted to note. The second thing I wanted to note is this sort of takes the burden off of what I was calling these epistemic arguments, but these arguments that God exists or that Christianity is true. Because you don't have to argue that Christianity is just straight up true or 90% probable or anything like that. You just have to argue that it's the most probable religion, even if, it's still, for some people, it's not, totally convincing, or they're not yes, I know this is true, I'm 100% sure, or even 90% sure. You don't have to make it that high. You just have to make it more probable than the other religions. And on some views, that could even be less than 50% probable. So I think that's kind of cool. It sort of takes the burden off of these other arguments and they don't like, and I guess too, I'll add here, like sometimes those arguments are tough, like they're good arguments and they're really interesting, but there's objections and replies to them, and it's like, is this really like a good argument? And sometimes you kind of doubt that, or you kind of question that. And what's cool about Pascal's wager is it doesn't have to be a totally convincing argument, it just needs to raise the probability a little bit. So I think that's kind of awesome. So that's what I sort of wanted to say about the role of Pascal's wager sort of in this broader context. Okay, and this is my last slide. This is just some further resources on the wager if you're interested. So for introductory resources, I really recommend Mike Roda's book, Taking Pascal's Wager. In this book, he basically says, look, if Christianity is 50% probable, then you should wager for it. Christianity is 50% probable, so you should wager for it. So it's actually a really similar strategy to what I was just talking about in the previous slide. And he gives a nice combination of both like intro to decision theory and intro to Pascal's wager and defense of Pascal's wager, and then also some arguments that raise the probability of Christianity. And then also another YouTube channel called Crash Course Apologetics, that's run by Jordan Hampton. Jordan has a video series where he basically explains and breaks down Mike Roda's book. He also talks about decision theory and goes into a little more detail than we were able to today. It's a really great series, and what you could even do is like read Mike Roda's book and then like watch Jordan's videos at the same time, and I think those would really complement each other really well. So that's where I would kind of recommend people start if they're interested in Pascal's wager but don't have a ton of background. In terms of intermediate resources, so for those of you that like have been interacting with philosophers, one thing you'll probably hear about is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And it's a really good kind of intermediate introduction. And why I say intermediate introduction is because it's going to be hard if you have like no philosophy background at all to really know what they're saying. But if you have some philosophy background, it's a great place to sort of learn about a topic and learn about some further resources. And all the entries have really long bibliographies. So the SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Pascal's wager was actually written by my old advisor at ANU, Al Hayek. So I would recommend that. Another resource that I think isn't talked about as much but is also really great is it's a journal that's called Philosophy Compass. And what I like about Philosophy Compass is that it is easier and shorter than the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So a lot of the articles in it, that might even be kind of in between the introductory and intermediate, because they're really meant for students to understand. They're not written at high of a level, and they're a little shorter, so it's not as much to digest, but they're still really good. And basically they just summarize big topics in philosophy. And Mike Roda has an article. Unfortunately, it's not. So that's the big downside of it. But there's like Facebook groups where you can request articles from that and get them for free. And I'm happy to send you ones too. I have access to it. So that is a huge downside. I know you can't just go to the website, but I really think like the articles in it are super valuable. So unfortunately, though, not open access. But Mike Roda has an article in it I think it's just called Pascal's Wager. So highly recommend that as well. And then there's actually just a PDF that I don't even know who wrote it, but it's just called An Introduction to Decision Theory. So I think it's open access. So I uploaded it to my website, and if you click on the link from the slides, you can just download that as a PDF. So that's sort of if you're interested in more sort of on decision theory. Also, too, if you're interested in decision theory, you can probably just go into YouTube and type in like Intro to Decision Theory, and I bet a lot of good stuff would pop up. Okay, and then a couple advanced resources. So a lot of people have heard of Mike Roda, but a less talked about name, but I think someone who still does a lot of interesting and good work on Pascal's wager is Jeff Jordan. So he's edited a volume on Pascal's wager, and he wrote a book, like a manuscript on Pascal's wager, and then he also is still publishing stuff in philosophy of religion. I think he has some papers on hope, maybe some other stuff. But anyways, so the book that I linked here is his 2016 book, which is just his kind of monograph on Pascal's wager, but there's an earlier edited volume also on Pascal's wager that he edited. They're both good, have a lot of good stuff in them. But a more recent book is just an edited volume. I think it's by Cambridge University Press, and it's by Bartha and Pasternak, and that has a lot of kind of updated contemporary articles on Pascal's wager that are pretty good. And finally, I have a big annotated bibliography of a bunch of kind of academic papers and works on Pascal's wager, and they're categorized by like pro-wager, anti-wager, historical stuff, introductory stuff. So if you want that, I'm happy to email that to anyone. So just send me an email. All right. I think that's it.
Thanks, Liz, for that presentation. It was so good. So good. I mean, I really like the way that you'll explain something, but then you'll break it down even further. And so I think that the people watching this, they're going to get a lot out of this. So that was really cool. So let's move on to some questions. And we have these already prepared. The first one is, who wagered the wagerer? So we asked the Bereans, and this is one of the questions that popped up. I thought it was funny because I asked this question to a couple of people during their courses, like Josh Rasmussen and who else was it? There was it was Luke Barnes. This question, who created God, who designed the designer, and so this question is just asked so often about these other arguments, but it's not a serious question. So let's get to
I don't know what the philosophical upshot of that would be. So anyway, yeah.
All right, so let's get to a serious question. Here it is. At what level of confidence that Christianity is true should someone take the wager? Is it 50%, 1%, and then why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is going to depend on the version of the wager that you go in for. So if you go in, so on that one side, in response to God's objection, I talked about the two versions. One is the finite version where you require like a probability threshold. And then the other was the infinite version where you should wager for the religion that you take to be most probable. So obviously on the first version, if it's probability threshold, then it would just be like whatever that threshold is, right? So Mike Rhoda's wager says it has to be 0.5, 50%. But you could, in theory, have a version that's lower than that, like 0.3 or 0.2 or something, right? And I think throughout the presentation, I talked about some of the upshots of going that way. But on my version, it could actually be any non-zero value as long as you thought Christianity was the most probable religion. You could take my version and then say that there has to be a probability threshold if you thought that was maybe like a good way to get around the worry about evidentialism, that wagering is irrational or something. So there are ways of bringing that threshold up if you think it's a good way to respond to certain objections. But technically on my version, one thing that I like about it that I think is a strength of it is that there's actually no certain threshold. It's just whatever religion you take to be most likely to be true. So it actually, I think, shows that a commitment to Christianity could be rational, even in the face of like tons and tons and tons and tons of doubt, as long as it's in some sense, like a live possibility for you. So does that your version of the wager, does it also take care of the really wacky view that you outlined earlier about like, all atheists go to heaven and all theists are all theists go to hell? So I think it sounds like the way that you deal with that objection is just to say, well, it's a whole lot less likely that that's true than something like Islam or Christianity is true. And so you still got to wager for like the religion or the view more broadly that you think is most probable. Exactly. Right. So if you, for some reason, thought you had a bunch of evidence that atheists go to heaven and theists go to hell, then, that would be one thing. And then we could actually just debate about that separately, right? Like who's likely to go to heaven or not. That's kind of a question we can actually separate. But then once we've sort of established like this is the most likely religion or whatever, then on my view, that's what you should wager for. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that Michael Rhoda pointed out in the interview that we did with him was that he wants to lower the bar for natural theology to go from like, having to be at 70, 80%, 90%, and 100% sometimes for some people. He wants to lower the bar for natural theology from all the way up there to something like 50%. Well, that's actually exactly what he says, 50%. So, but it seems like on your version, you can go a whole lot lower than 50% and still have like the outcome that you want, right? So it could be, Christianity could be 0.00001% likely, but as long as that's the most likely religion, then the rational thing to do is still to wager for that religion.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of like I was talking about the cost benefit analysis of my version versus Mike's version. And I think this is one really interesting benefit of mine, that you can actually get this really strong claim. And of course, like that slide where I said, here's a bunch of other objections, you would want to deal with those and have things to say about those. But assuming you did, you can get this really, really strong claim, which I think is kind of cool. So. Yeah,
not just kind of cool. It's really cool. All right. Here's the next question. What are the most common and powerful objections to your specific formulation of the wager?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my version in particular, I guess I put a lot of them on that final slide, but I guess maybe I'll mention one that is a problem for my version, but not Mike's, and that has to do with this infinities trumping finites thing. So here's something I'm really worried about, and I actually don't know if I have a good answer for it right now. Let's say uh, you could be tortured for 10,000 years. But if you're tortured for 10,000 years, then you have a zero point 0.1 chance at getting a small increase in pleasure in every day in heaven. So because it's, even though it's a small chance, because it's every day in heaven, that's going to actually end up having infinite value, right? It's going to last for all eternity, and you have a small chance at getting this increase, right? But it doesn't necessarily seem worth being tortured for 10,000 years, right? So these kind of thought experiments put pressure on this idea that infinities always trump finites. And I mean, maybe one thing you could say in response to this is, well, maybe infinities don't always trump finites, but they at least do in this set of cases, and the wager sort of falls in that set of cases. But these kind of thought experiments, they worry me for sure, because it seems intuitive that you shouldn't, there are some finite goods that like I wouldn't give up for a small chance at a little bit of increase in happiness every day in heaven, you know? So that's a worry for my version, and I think most versions of the wager that keep infinities in them. And that would be another reason maybe to prefer either Mike's version or just a finite version, because you wouldn't have to deal with those kinds of cases.
That's a very very honest reply there. All right, here's another question. How do you factor in different outcomes for different religions? For example, you're not a Muslim. If you're not a Muslim and Islam is true, you're going to hell. But if you're, sorry, I've got this laying over my question here. If you're not Muslim and Islam is true, you're going to hell. But if you're not Mormon and Mormonism is true, then you'll only go to a lower tier, heaven, etc.
Yeah, good. So the wager is definitely going to, in some sense, privilege religions that actually do have heaven and hell. We're going to get to universalism in a second, but I will say this is consistent with believing universalism. That's fine. But it is going to sort of give us a reason to practice a religion that, at least on a lot of theologies, does have a heaven and a hell. So if, like, on Mormonism, there's probability 1 that everyone goes to heaven, but they're just different levels of heaven, then we're going to have a stronger reason to practice like Christianity or Islam. So that's going to just be because of basically the reward punishment structure. There's not, if I'm going to go to heaven anyway, if I practice Mormonism, then might as well practice another religion in case that one's true. So things do get a little complex here because you have to weigh the probabilities against these kinds of considerations. But actually, if you look at my paper that I talked about called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, we actually do a little bit of that, and we give an example of how you might weigh sort of these considerations about heaven and hell against like questions about the probability of certain religions.
Okay, here's our next question. Why shouldn't I just commit to Christ on my deathbed?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I kind of had 3 thoughts about this, but it is something I would like to think about more, so I'll say that. I guess the first is like, you just don't know when you're going to die, and that's kind of a big risk to take. I don't know like statistics offhand about how many people, die suddenly or whatever, but there is a chance that you die suddenly before you've committed to God, and that seems like a pretty big risk. So that's at least one reason not to. A second reason not to is that, even if you have a traditional view on which there is heaven and hell, that's still consistent with there being like different levels of heaven, and some levels of heaven even being like infinitely better than others. So if there are levels of heaven, then even if you do go to heaven on the basis of a deathbed conversion, which I guess I'm not necessarily saying you do or you don't, but I'm just sort of assuming for the sake of argument that you do. But even if you do, waiting to convert until you right before you die would likely put you like on a lower level of heaven than a higher level of heaven. So that could be another reason. And then I guess a third reason And this is a version of Pascal's wager that I didn't talk a lot about, but I actually think is really interesting. There's so much here, and there's just a lot I couldn't cover for the sake of time, and I already went kind of long. But another interesting version of Pascal's wager basically says committing to God or practicing a religion is better no matter how the world is. And that's because of these studies that actually show that religious people are kind of happier and healthier and, like less likely to get divorced. And, this is a complex question, and it does take empirical studies to verify. And I don't think it's necessarily settled or anything. But if you did think there was really good evidence that theists are happier than atheists or religious people are happier than non-religious people, then you could actually have a version of the wager that say, look, like whether God exists or not, you're going to be better off practicing a religion or being a theist. So if you're kind of convinced by that style of argument, then you would have reason to not wait until your deathbed to convert, but to actually like glean those benefits of living a religious life. So
here's the next question. Can a universalist endorse Pascal's wager?
So the answer is definitely yes. And universalists can definitely endorse Pascal's wager. And Pascal's wager is actually, it's totally consistent with believing that universalism is true, as long as you don't think it has probability 1. So I guess I'll just say there's a lot of things that we believe, even though we don't give them probability 1. Like my car is parked here. Like I believe that, but someone could have moved it, or like it's going to rain tomorrow, but like, the forecast could be wrong, right? So you could believe universalism as long as you think there's some chance you're wrong, then you can get Pascal's wager kind of off the ground. And then I guess I'll also note too, again, if there are so let's say everyone goes to heaven and we give that probability 1. So we're 100% sure everyone goes to heaven. You could still get the wager off the ground if you just think there's levels of heaven, and that living your life for God or practicing a religion would get you into a higher level of heaven rather than a lower level of heaven. And I guess too, I'll also say, I just thought of this, if you like that argument I was just talking about where theists actually are happier and healthier than atheists, so it's even, it's better to be a theist in this life, whether, apart from afterlife stuff. Then you could also just sort of make a version of the wager that relies on that as well. But yeah, the point is, yes, you can definitely be a universalist and endorse Pascal's wager. And I also think, I'll add this too, believing universalism is often not a salvation matter, right? So I think most people aren't going to say, oh, you lived a Christian life, but because you're a universalist, you go to hell. We all have doctrinal beliefs that aren't quite right. And I don't think that's a core matter, right? So it's not like if you believe universalism, you're taking this huge risk. That wouldn't be the issue. So I'll note that too.
So here's the next question. This fake it till you make it kind of idea doesn't really sound biblical to me.
Yeah, good. I mean, honestly, this is a whole nother interview probably, or series of interviews, because I think it would actually be really interesting to actually look at different verses and kind of see what they say about this kind of thing. But I guess a couple things to say. So one thing is that there's a lot of different versions of Pascal's wager, and some people in a related objection will say this is just really selfish, all you're doing is caring about whether you're in heaven or not, that's just terrible motives. But I think it's important to note that there's a big difference between being selfish and being self-interested. So it's selfish if you hog the whole pizza for yourself and don't share it with anyone else, even though they're really hungry. But self-interested just means you're doing something that coincides with one of your goals. Again, brushing your teeth, right? It's not selfish to brush your teeth. It doesn't really affect other people, at least maybe directly, but it's just something that it's one of your goals, to not have rotten teeth or have to get those horrible things at the dentist when they drill your mouth open and stuff. So that's the first thing to note, is just because it's about your desires or goals, that doesn't mean it's selfish. But the second thing to note, and I think maybe more importantly, is that the way that I see Pascal's wager is part of it is showing how a Christian commitment is consistent with very serious doubts. And I actually think that this is a totally biblical idea. And one of my favorite stories that kind of illustrates this is the story about the man who asked Jesus to heal his daughter and says, I think it's in Mark, he says, I believe, but help my unbelief, And so I like to think about that man as actually doing something that you could think about as similar to Pascal's wager. You're saying, I want to believe, I believe, I have faith in you, God, but I also have doubts and I really struggle with this, and help my unbelief. And you can frame the motives behind that kind of statement as really pure motives that I think God would be totally satisfied with. Like, look, if I pursue this relationship with God and God exists, I have this great good. I get to know God, I get to see the beatific vision, and if I don't, like, maybe I can like live my life in certain ways that I want, but I just don't want to take that risk. So I think you can frame the motives in a lot of different ways, but it's not at all obvious to me that at least some versions of Pascal's wager aren't totally biblical, and I think they can actually be really helpful in showing Christians how we can deal with doubts and sort of persist in our commitments even in light of doubts.
I love that. Okay, here's our last question for today. How does this compare to Pascal's wager? If masks do nothing to stop the spread, there's no harm in wearing them. But if they do stop the spread, it's morally binding to do so.
So Cam actually sent me this Google Doc ahead of time and with the questions, and I didn't get that until you just read. I was like, Pascal, is that like some kind of like researcher? Like, who is that? I almost actually even Googled it, but anyway, I just got that. Okay. Yeah. Good. So I actually think, so when we were talking about Pascal's mugging, we talked about various cases where you have to pay some cost to get some low probability, but like really good outcome. And the thought is like sometimes those are rational and sometimes those are irrational. And it's actually really tricky to say like when rational and when irrational. So I think depending on what you said about that distinction, you could either say that this kind of reasoning is rational or irrational. I personally think this is actually a potentially good reason to wear a mask because it is a small inconvenience, but you could actually be saving a lot of lives if it turned out that masks were really useful. So I'm pretty open to this being a pretty decent argument. I guess I just took a political stance publicly. Well, this is only for, I guess, your supporters, so not super publicly, but but whatever. I mean, it's fine. I think this is actually a decent argument. But if you had a way to draw the line between those, you could maybe make it work so it wasn't. But anyway,
it's annoying to me that it's actually a political stance at this point. I think that wearing a mask is kind of obvious for these same types of reasons about the decision matrix and stuff. Actually, when you noted at the very beginning that we can use this kind of decision matrix and use it to make rational decisions in our life, I want to start doing that now. Like I want to like try it out and see how it works. That's really cool. No, like it might even be cool to do it.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to talk about the election, like who to vote for in this election, like who. That seems like it'd be kind of complex, actually.
I mean, it gets hard. I think the hardest part is like assigning the numbers. Like in the coin flip case, it was easy, like 50-50, but a lot of times it's hard to assign those probabilities. But literally, like last year when I was buying car insurance, I literally like drew up a decision table, and then I figured out like what is the probability that I get in a wreck have to be in order for this to be worth it. And then I don't know, maybe I'm just like too optimistic about my driving abilities, but it ended up not being worth it. I have like the basic insurance, but to get like the really intense insurance that like covers you no matter what, based on like the value of my car and stuff. So I didn't get like more expensive car insurance, and it actually paid off. I didn't get in a wreck, but anyway.
Interesting.
But yeah, decision theory is super useful. It's really great. And some of the resources I talked about earlier, you can use those to sort of help you see how it can apply. But I think it helps a lot because it's like we aren't always like, even like pros and cons lists are helpful, but like I think we're not always properly weighing considerations in our mind. And sometimes what we do is we rule out a certain option. Like when you're deciding which flight to buy, you might just be like, that one's too expensive, and rule it out. But actually, if you had done decision theory with it, you would see that because it meets all your other criteria, it's worth paying a little bit more money for it. That's just one example. But yeah, I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, I want to start using it. For sure. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Liz, for coming on and doing this thing on Pascal's wager. It was so good. And getting an introduction to it and some of the updated forms of it and stuff, I think it's so important and so helpful. So thanks again for coming on. And thank you guys for taking part of this course, this series, all 12 of these. We've reached the end, and it has been amazing. It's been incredible. I hope that you've got a lot out of it. And make sure to tell your friends about it to help them, encourage them to take the course as well. I even had someone message me earlier today saying that they just they've loved the videos so far. So, So thank you guys for watching, taking part, and we will see you later.